The capital city of Loria buzzed with restless excitement. It wasn't every day that the Verexi, a race of reptilian humanoids, infamous for their brutal wars and iron-fisted diplomacy, visited a human colony. Their colossal warship hovered above the city like a looming storm, its shadow casting a chilling pall over the golden spires below. For most, the Verexi's arrival was a cause for trepidation. Their fearsome reputation was dwarfed only by the tales of the beast they kept as their ultimate weapon, Draxor, the dragon of Nyxara. The creature was said to be unstoppable, a living nightmare that had razed entire civilizations. Jamie Renfield, however, wasn't most people. At 8 years old, his boundless curiosity often led him where others feared to tread. While the adults whispered warnings and crowded around news feeds, Jamie sat on the windowsill of his family's modest apartment, craning his neck for a glimpse of the alien visitors. "Jamie, get away from there," his mother Mara scolded, her voice sharp with worry. "You know what they say about the Verexi? It's not safe to be anywhere near them." Jamie hopped down but didn't lose his spark of wonder. But what if they're not as bad as people think? What if they're just different? His mother sighed, brushing her hands on her apron. "They're not different, Jamie. They're dangerous. Promise me you'll stay close today. No wandering off." Jamie crossed his fingers behind his back and nodded, though his mind was already working on a plan. The Verexi weren't dangerous, they were fascinating. And as for Draxor, the stories sounded too wild to be true. Surely no creature could be that monstrous. When Mara left to join the other citizens gathering near the city's square for the Verexi procession, Jamie waited just long enough to be sure she wouldn't notice his absence. Then, with a quick glance back at the empty apartment, he slipped out. The streets of Loria were packed with people, their murmurs a low hum of fear and curiosity. Towering Verexi warriors marched in formation, their scaled armor glinting in the sunlight. Behind them rolled a massive hover cage, its glowing bars crackling with energy. Inside was the legendary Draxor. Jamie's breath caught as he caught sight of the dragon. It was unlike anything he had ever imagined. The beast's obsidian scales shimmered like liquid metal, and its eyes burned with a deep orange glow like molten lava. Its wings were folded tightly against its body, but even at rest, it exuded an aura of raw, terrifying power. Chains thicker than tree trunks secured its neck and legs, connected to the hover cage that groaned under its weight. The crowd recoiled as Draxor let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through the square like distant thunder. The Verexi commander, a hulking figure with golden-scaled armor, barked orders in their guttural language. Jamie watched in awe as the dragon's gaze swept over the crowd. Most people averted their eyes, trembling. Jamie, however, stepped closer. "What are you doing?" a boy hissed, pulling on Jamie's sleeve. It was one of his classmates, clearly terrified. "You'll get yourself killed." Jamie shrugged him off. "He doesn't look like he wants to hurt anyone. He just looks sad." The boy gaped at him, then scurried back into the crowd. Jamie took another step forward, drawn by something he couldn't explain. Despite the chains and the fearsome growls, Draxor didn't seem like a monster. There was an intelligence in its eyes, a depth that sparked Jamie's curiosity even further. The closer Jamie moved to the hover cage, the more the world around him seemed to fade away. The roar of the crowd, the sharp commands of the Verexi, even his own fear, all of it dimmed in the presence of the mighty dragon. "Stop!" a Verexi warrior barked, his scaled hand gripping the hilt of a serrated blade. "Return to your people, human child." Jamie froze, his heart pounding. For a moment he considered obeying, but then his gaze shifted to Draxor. The dragon's massive head was turned toward him, its molten eyes locked onto his. The beast didn't growl or bare its teeth. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if curious. "Let him through," came another voice, sharp and commanding. The crowd fell silent as the Verexi commander stepped forward. His golden-scaled armor shimmered, and his piercing gaze swept over Jamie. "Let us see what this human intends." The warrior reluctantly stepped aside, and Jamie found himself with a clear path to the dragon. His legs trembled as he took a cautious step forward. The air around the cage was hot, almost suffocating, as if the dragon radiated its own fiery aura. "Jamie!" His mother's voice rang out from somewhere in the crowd. He ignored it, his focus entirely on Draxor. The dragon lowered its massive head, bringing its snout closer to the edge of the cage. Its breath was hot and smelled faintly of sulfur. "You're not scary," Jamie whispered, his voice shaking but resolute. "You're just misunderstood." He reached out a hand, his small fingers trembling as they hovered inches from the dragon's nose. The Verexi guards tensed, their weapons raised. The crowd held its collective breath. Even the commander seemed poised for chaos. And then Jamie did the unthinkable. He leaned forward and kissed the dragon gently on the nose. The world seemed to stop. The crowd gasped, the Verexi warriors froze, and the commander's jaw tightened in disbelief. Draxor's eyes, once burning with molten fury, softened. The dragon let out a low, rumbling sound, not a growl, but something closer to a purr. It nudged its nose against Jamie's hand, a gesture so gentle it seemed impossible for a creature of its size and power. Jamie smiled, his fear replaced with pure joy. "See, you're not so bad." The Verexi commander took a step forward, his expression a mix of astonishment and something deeper, perhaps even respect. "This is unprecedented," he muttered in his guttural tone. "Draxor, the untamable, has chosen to spare this human." "Chosen?" Jamie asked, looking up at the towering alien. The commander's gaze shifted between Jamie and the dragon. "It seems Draxor has accepted you. No one, not even my kind, has ever touched it and lived." Jamie looked back at Draxor, his hand still resting on its warm, scaled snout. Maybe no one ever tried being nice to him. The crowd erupted into whispers, and Jamie's mother pushed through the throng, her face pale with a mix of fear and relief. She grabbed Jamie, pulling him back. "What were you thinking?" she demanded. "I wasn't thinking," Jamie said, glancing back at Draxor. "I just knew he wouldn't hurt me." The commander's sharp laughter cut through the murmurs. "This human child has courage," he said, addressing both the Verexi and the humans. "Perhaps more than any of us." As the dragon rumbled softly, Jamie couldn't help but smile. He had done the impossible, bridged a gap no one else dared to cross. The square was eerily quiet, the weight of what had just occurred sinking into the stunned crowd. Jamie stood at the edge of the hover cage, his small hand still resting on Draxor's snout. The Verexi commander, a figure of cold authority, watched the boy intently, his sharp, reptilian eyes betraying the faintest flicker of curiosity. "What did you do?" Jamie's mother asked, her voice trembling with equal parts anger and disbelief. She had pulled Jamie close, but her gaze remained fixed on the massive dragon, which now regarded her son with a calm, almost protective demeanor. Jamie shrugged, his eyes wide with innocent wonder. "I kissed him," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the universe. The Verexi warriors shifted uneasily, their serrated weapons still drawn. The dragon, their weapon of terror and destruction, had never behaved like this before. Draxor had razed cities, turned fleets into ash, and even the Verexi treated it with a mix of fear and reverence. But now it was calm, docile. "Commander Vrax," one of the warriors hissed, his tone laced with unease. "This is unnatural. Draxor should have devoured him. It's—" "Enough," Vrax interrupted, his voice sharp and commanding. His golden-scaled armor glinted as he stepped closer to the cage, his eyes narrowing at Jamie. "The boy has done what no Verexi could. He has touched the untouchable." Jamie tilted his head, frowning. "He's not untouchable. He's just lonely." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd, both human and Verexi alike. Jamie's mother looked at her son in disbelief. "Jamie, don't be ridiculous. That thing—" She gestured toward the dragon. "It's a monster." "No, he's not," Jamie said firmly, pulling away from her grasp. He turned back to Draxor, who rumbled softly, the sound vibrating through the ground. "He's just misunderstood." Commander Vrax studied Jamie for a long moment before stepping closer to the boy. His towering frame cast a shadow over Jamie, but the child didn't flinch. "Human," Vrax said, his voice low and thoughtful. "You claim to understand this creature?" Jamie shrugged again, his small shoulders rising and falling. "I don't know if I understand him, but I think he understands me." Vrax's gaze flicked to the dragon. Draxor's molten eyes met his, unblinking. There was something unsettling in the way the beast looked at the commander, a quiet defiance, as if it no longer saw him as a master. "This changes things," Vrax muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He turned to his warriors, gesturing sharply. "Secure the perimeter, no one leaves." The Verexi soldiers hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances, but they obeyed. The humans in the crowd grew restless, their fear bubbling to the surface. Jamie's mother gripped his arm tightly, her voice rising. "What's going on?" You can't just keep us here. Vrax ignored her, his focus remaining on Jamie. The boy will stay. He has forged a bond with Draxor. I must understand how. Jamie and his mother were escorted into the Virexi's temporary encampment on the outskirts of the city. The dragon's hover cage was positioned in the center, surrounded by imposing warriors and glowing energy barriers. Despite the tension in the air, Jamie showed no fear. His eyes remained fixed on Draxor, who now lay inside the cage, its massive head resting on its forepaws. Commander Vrax motioned for Jamie to approach. If the bond you claim is real, then prove it. Jamie hesitated, glancing back at his mother, who shook her head vehemently. No, absolutely not, she exclaimed, stepping between her son and the commander. He's just a child. You've already put him in enough danger. Mom, Jamie said softly, his small hand tugging on her sleeve. It's okay. I want to. Mara's eyes filled with tears. Jamie, please. I'll be fine, he promised, his voice steady. Draxor won't hurt me. Vrax gestured impatiently, and the cage's energy field was lowered. The air crackled as the barrier dissipated, leaving only the massive chains that bound the dragon to the hover platform. The crowd held its breath as Jamie stepped forward. Draxor lifted its head, its glowing eyes locking onto Jamie. For a moment, the beast was utterly still, its hulking frame radiating an intimidating power. Then, slowly, it lowered its head, bringing its snout to Jamie's level. Hey, big guy, Jamie said softly, reaching out a hand. He placed it gently on the dragon's nose, the warmth of its scales seeping into his palm. You remember me, don't you? Draxor let out a deep, rumbling sound that made the ground vibrate. To the Virexi, it was an unearthly noise, terrifying in its resonance. But to Jamie, it was a sound of recognition. The boy smiled. See? You're not scary. The Virexi warriors watched in stunned silence. Even Vrax, who had maintained his stoic demeanor throughout the encounter, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. This is impossible, one of the warriors muttered. The beast submits to no one. Jamie turned back to the commander, his hand still resting on Draxor's snout. He's not a beast. He just needs someone to care about him. Vrax's gaze darkened. You speak of this creature as if it were capable of understanding such things. Do you truly believe it feels emotions? Jamie nodded. Of course it does. Look at him. He's not angry anymore. The dragon rumbled again, its massive body shifting slightly. Jamie stepped closer, brushing his fingers along the edge of Draxor's snout. You don't want to hurt anyone, do you? He whispered. To everyone's astonishment, Draxor shook its massive head, the chains around its neck clinking softly. Vrax's sharp intake of breath broke the silence. This changes everything, he said quietly. He turned to his warriors, his voice firm. Release the chains. Commander? One of the guards asked, his voice laced with disbelief. You heard me, Vrax snapped. Release the chains. I must see what happens. The warriors hesitated but obeyed, unlocking the massive restraints. The crowd gasped as the final chain fell away, leaving Draxor completely unbound. For a moment, the dragon stood still, its molten eyes scanning the gathered Virexi and humans. Then, to everyone's shock, it lowered itself to the ground, curling its massive body protectively around Jamie. The boy laughed, leaning against the dragon's side. Told you, he said, looking up at Vrax. He's not bad. The commander stared at the scene, his expression unreadable. For the first time in his life, he felt the icy grip of doubt. If a child could tame the untamable, then perhaps everything he thought he knew about power and fear was wrong. And that terrified him. The Virexi encampment buzzed with tension and disbelief. For the first time in their storied history, their mighty weapon, Draxor, the untamable force that had obliterated countless enemies, lay unchained, docile as a house pet, its massive body curled protectively around an 8-year-old human boy. Virexi warriors exchanged uneasy glances, their hands hovering near their weapons, ready to strike if the dragon reverted to its ferocious nature. But Draxor showed no signs of aggression. Its molten eyes softened as Jamie rested against its massive flank, his small hand stroking its shimmering black scales. The boy's mother, Mara, stood frozen near the edge of the encampment, her fear mingled with astonishment. Commander Vrax paced nearby, his sharp claws clicking against the metal surface of the hover platform. His golden armor gleamed under the pale light of the encampment's energy towers, but his expression was clouded. This was more than an anomaly. It was a challenge to everything the Virexi believed. Vrax approached Jamie cautiously, his towering frame casting a long shadow. "Human child," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "you claim to have bonded with Draxor, yet you have no knowledge of his creation, his purpose, or the destruction he has wrought." Jamie looked up at the commander, his bright eyes unflinching. "I don't care what he's done," he said firmly. "He's not bad now." Vrax's jaw tightened. "You speak as if the past can be erased. This creature is not a pet. It is a weapon forged to destroy." Jamie shook his head. "He's more than that. You just don't see it." Before Vrax could respond, one of his warriors approached, saluting sharply. "Commander, the perimeter sensors have detected a fleet entering the system. Hostile configuration." Vrax turned sharply, his expression darkening. "Humans?" The warrior shook his head. "No, it's the Lorthak." A ripple of unease spread through the encampment. The Lorthak were a brutal and relentless species, known for their devastating raids. Their ships had wiped out entire Verexi colonies in the past, and now they were here, no doubt eager to strike at their rivals. "They've come for us," Vrax muttered. His sharp gaze flicked back to Draxor. "Prepare the dragon." At the mention of battle, Draxor rumbled, lifting its massive head. Jamie frowned, stepping in front of the beast as if to shield it. "You're not going to make him fight, are you?" Vrax sneered. "Draxor is our greatest weapon. If the Lorthak attack, we will unleash him as we always have." "No." Jamie's voice was loud and defiant, surprising everyone. He stepped closer to Vrax, his small frame trembling with determination. "He's not a weapon. He's not going to fight for you." Vrax's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. "This is not your decision, boy. The Lorthak will slaughter us all if we do not defend ourselves." Jamie turned to Draxor, placing a hand on its snout. "You don't want to hurt anyone, do you?" he asked softly. The dragon rumbled in response, a sound that was neither a growl nor a roar, just a deep, resonant acknowledgement. The boy looked back at Vrax, his expression fierce. "If you let him fight, it's because you're forcing him to. That's not fair." Vrax was about to retort when the sky lit up with streaks of plasma fire. The first wave of Lorthak ships had arrived, their dark, insect-like designs slicing through the atmosphere. Explosions erupted along the perimeter, and Verexi warriors scrambled to their positions. The battle had begun. The Lorthak assault was relentless. Plasma bolts rained down from their ships, obliterating the outer defenses and sending Verexi warriors scattering. The encampment was thrown into chaos as explosions lit up the night. Commander Vrax barked orders, his voice cutting through the cacophony. "Deploy the heavy cannons. Hold the line." Jamie clung to Draxor's side, his heart pounding. The dragon let out a low growl, its molten eyes narrowing as it watched the chaos unfold. Jamie could feel the tension in the beast's massive frame, a primal energy begging to be unleashed. "Draxor," Jamie whispered, his voice trembling, "you don't have to do this." The dragon turned its head, its eyes meeting Jamie's. In that moment, Jamie saw something in Draxor's gaze, understanding, maybe even resolve. The boy's small hand rested on the dragon's snout, his fingers trembling. "It's your choice," Jamie said, "not theirs." The ground shook as a Lorthak dropship landed nearby, disgorging a swarm of insectoid soldiers. Their chittering cries filled the air as they advanced on the Verexi positions, their plasma weapons cutting down anything in their path. The Verexi warriors fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Commander Vrax approached the dragon, his expression grim. "The time for debate is over," he said sharply. "Draxor must fight, or we are all doomed." Before Jamie could protest, Draxor rose to its full height, towering over everyone. The chains that had once bound it now lay forgotten, and the dragon spread its massive wings, the strength, their dark expanse blotting out the stars. It let out a roar that shook the ground, its fiery breath lighting up the battlefield. Vrax smirked. Finally, but instead of charging into battle, Draxor turned its head toward Jamie. The boy looked up at the beast, his heart racing. "You don't have to do this if you don't want to," he said softly. "It's your choice." For a moment, the dragon hesitated, its molten eyes flicking between Jamie and the battlefield. Then, with a powerful beat of its wings, it launched itself into the sky. The Verexi and Lorthak alike stopped in their tracks, their eyes drawn to the awe-inspiring sight. Draxor flew toward the Lorthak fleet, its massive form a silhouette against the fiery sky. Plasma bolts streaked toward it, but the dragon dodged with incredible agility, weaving through the chaos. When it reached the largest Lorthak ship, it unleashed a torrent of fire, engulfing the vessel in flames. The ship exploded in a brilliant flash, scattering debris across the battlefield. The Lorthak soldiers faltered, their advance slowing as their fleet was thrown into disarray. Draxor roared again, diving toward the ground. It landed with a thunderous impact, its claws tearing through the alien soldiers with terrifying precision. The tide of the battle shifted. Inspired by the dragon's ferocity, the Verexi rallied, pushing back the Lorthak forces. Jaime watched in awe as Draxor fought not out of obligation, but out of choice. The dragon's fury was unmatched, but it moved with purpose, never harming the Verexi or the humans. By the time the last Lorthak ship retreated, the battlefield was silent, except for the crackling of flames. Draxor stood in the center, its massive frame silhouetted against the destruction. The Verexi warriors stared in stunned silence, their weapons lowered. Commander Vrax approached the dragon cautiously. "You chose to fight," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief, "but not because we commanded you." Draxor rumbled softly, its gaze shifting to Jaime. The boy stepped forward, his small hand resting on the dragon's snout. "He fought because he wanted to," Jaime said, his voice filled with quiet pride, "not because he had to." Vrax nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps we have underestimated this creature, and you, human child." As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Draxor lowered itself to the ground, curling protectively around Jaime once more. The battle was over, but the bond between boy and dragon was stronger than ever. For the first time in its existence, Draxor was free, and it had chosen to protect, not destroy. The battlefield was quiet now, save for the faint crackle of dying fires and the hum of damaged machinery. The Verexi encampment was in ruins, but the Lorthak had been repelled. Their once overwhelming force had been decimated, and the surviving ships had fled into the void. Yet, amidst the destruction, hope glimmered. A strange, fragile hope centered on an unchained dragon and the boy who had tamed it. Jaime sat by Draxor's side, leaning against the dragon's massive foreleg as he caught his breath. The beast, though covered in scorch marks and shallow wounds, radiated calm. Its molten orange eyes, which once blazed with ferocity, now flickered softly as they watched over the boy. Commander Vrax strode through the wreckage, his golden armor dented but still gleaming in the dawn's light. Behind him, his warriors moved with a tentative air, their gazes darting between the devastation and the dragon. For a species built on the principles of dominance and fear, this moment was a turning point, and an uncomfortable one at that. The commander stopped a few paces from Jaime, his sharp gaze flicking between the boy and the dragon. "Your actions today have forced me to reconsider much, human child," Vrax said, his voice unusually subdued. "Draxor's power has always been a weapon, a force we could control, but today it acted of its own will, and it chose to protect." Jaime looked up at Vrax, his small face streaked with soot, but resolute. "He's not just a weapon. He's alive, like you and me. He can choose what he wants." Vrax's eyes narrowed. "A creature of such power free to choose? That is a dangerous idea." "It's not dangerous if you trust him," Jaime countered, his voice firm. "He didn't hurt you, did he? He fought to save all of us, not because you made him, but because he wanted to." Draxor let out a deep rumble, tilting its massive head slightly, as if to affirm Jaime's words. The commander stared at the dragon for a long moment, his mind working through thoughts that clearly troubled him. One of Vrax's warriors stepped forward, his voice filled with unease. "Commander, the Lorthak will return. We cannot hold this position without Draxor's might. He must remain under our control." Jaime stood up, his small frame somehow radiating defiance. "You don't control him anymore," he said. "He's not a slave." The warrior sneered, but Vrax raised a hand to silence him. "Enough," the commander said sharply. His gaze softened slightly as he turned back to Jaime. "You have a remarkable gift, human child. You have accomplished what none of us ever could. But now you must decide. What do we do with Draxor?" Jaime hesitated, glancing at the dragon. Draxor's eyes met his, a silent understanding passing between them. Finally, Jaime looked back at Vrax. "He's coming with me." The crowd of warriors murmured in shock, their disbelief rippling through the ranks. Vrax raised a hand again, silencing them. "And what will you do with such power, boy? What will you teach this creature now that it listens to you?" Jaime's voice was quiet but steady. "I'll teach him to be free." The Verexi began their slow process of rebuilding, though the atmosphere among them remained tense. For generations, their culture had revolved around domination and fear. The idea of a free Draxor was not just revolutionary, it was destabilizing. Despite the protests of many warriors, Vrax honored Jaime's request. If the dragon truly trusts this boy, the commander reasoned, then perhaps we must trust the dragon. The decision sent ripples of uncertainty through the Verexi ranks, but none dared openly challenge their leader. Jaime, his mother Mara, and Draxor prepared to leave the encampment. The boy's mother, though still pale with worry, had finally accepted the bond between her son and the beast. "You're braver than I'll ever understand," she whispered to Jaime, holding him tightly before they boarded the Resolute. "Just promise me you'll stay safe." "I will," Jaime said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "And I'll make sure Draxor is safe too." The massive dragon, now unchained, followed Jaime into the Resolute's cargo bay. The ship groaned under its weight, but the creature settled into a crouch, its molten eyes scanning its new surroundings. Jaime climbed onto the dragon's foreleg, running his fingers over its scales. "Don't worry, big guy," he said softly. "We'll figure this out together." Commander Vrax watched from the edge of the encampment as the Resolute powered up. His expression was unreadable, but when Jaime waved to him from the cockpit window, the commander raised a clawed hand in a gesture of respect. As the ship lifted off, Mara piloting with a mix of nerves and determination, Jaime sat by Draxor's side, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. The dragon's body radiated warmth, and its deep, rhythmic breathing filled the cargo bay with a sense of calm. "Where are we going?" Jaime asked his mother as the Resolute broke through the atmosphere and into the stars. Mara glanced back at him, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Somewhere safe, somewhere we can start over." Jaime nodded, his hand resting on Draxor's snout. The dragon rumbled softly, as if content with the answer. Hours later, as the ship glided through the endless expanse of space, Jaime sat on the floor of the cargo bay, leaning against Draxor's massive side. The dragon's molten eyes were half closed, its body relaxed for the first time in what felt like eons. "Do you think they'll come after us?" Jaime asked, his voice soft. Mara's voice crackled over the intercom. "The Verexi? Maybe, but I think Commander Vrax has bigger things to worry about than chasing a little boy and his dragon." Jaime chuckled, his hand idly tracing patterns on Draxor's scales. "We'll be okay," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "Right, Draxor?" The dragon rumbled in response, its massive tail flicking lightly against the floor. Jaime smiled, his eyes drifting to the stars outside the viewport. The galaxy was vast and full of dangers, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them. With Draxor by his side, anything seemed possible. The Resolute hummed softly as it sailed through hyperspace, the stars stretching into luminous streaks beyond the viewport. Jaime sat on the floor of the cargo bay, leaning against Draxor's warm, scaled side. The dragon's rhythmic breathing filled the space, soothing the boy's nerves. It had been a day since they left the Verexi encampment, and while the ship offered the illusion of safety, Jaime couldn't shake the feeling that trouble wasn't far behind. Mara's voice crackled through the intercom. "Jaime, you should get some rest." "I'm fine, Mom," Jaime replied, his eyes fixed on the streaking stars. "What about you?" Mara's response carried a hint of tension. "I'm keeping an eye on the scanners. Something doesn't feel right." Jaime shifted uneasily, glancing at Draxor. The dragon rumbled softly, its molten orange eyes opening to meet his. "They're coming, aren't they?" Jaime whispered. Draxor growled low in his throat, a sound that was neither aggressive nor calm. It was a warning. Moments later, the proximity alarm blared. Mara's voice came sharply over the intercom. "We've got incoming." Jaime scrambled to the cockpit, Draxor rising behind him with a massive stretch of its wings. On the scanner, 3 blips approached rapidly from hyperspace. Mara gritted her teeth as she adjusted the ship's controls. "They followed us. Verexi patrol ships." Jaime's heart sank. "Commander Vrax?" "No," Mara said, her voice tight. "This isn't Vrax. These are hunters." The Resolute jolted as it dropped out of hyperspace, the Verexi ships emerging behind them. Sleek and predatory, the vessels opened fire immediately, their plasma bolts streaking through the void. Mara swerved the Resolute, narrowly avoiding a direct hit. Draxor let out a deafening roar, its wings brushing the walls of the cargo bay. The sound reverberated through the ship, shaking Jamie to his core. The dragon's molten eyes blazed with fury as it paced, its claws clinking against the metal floor. "What do we do?" Jamie asked, panic rising in his voice. Mara's face was pale, but determined. "We fight back." Mara flipped the Resolute's limited weapon systems online, firing back at the pursuing ships. The plasma bolts weren't strong enough to do serious damage, but they forced the hunters to scatter. Jamie held onto the console, his eyes darting between the viewport and Draxor, who growled impatiently. "They're going to overwhelm us," Mara shouted, as a bolt struck the ship's rear shields, sending sparks flying across the cockpit. Jamie turned to Draxor, an idea forming in his mind. "We have to let him out." Mara's eyes widened. "Are you crazy? If we open the cargo bay, he'll save us," Jamie interrupted, his voice steady. "You have to trust him." Mara hesitated, her hands gripping the controls. Another plasma bolt rocked the ship, and an alarm blared. The shields were failing. With a sharp nod, she made her decision. "Fine, but if this goes wrong, it won't," Jamie said, already sprinting toward the cargo bay. Draxor followed, its massive form moving with purpose. The cargo bay door opened and the vacuum of space howled as Draxor crouched at the edge. The dragon spread its enormous wings, the glow from its molten eyes illuminating the dark expanse. Jamie stood beside it, the rush of air tugging at his hair. "You can do this," Jamie said, his voice firm despite the fear in his chest. "I believe in you." Draxor growled deeply, then launched itself into the void. The sheer force of its departure shook the ship, and Jamie stumbled back, watching as the dragon soared toward the Verexi hunters. The pursuing ships hesitated, their pilots clearly unprepared for this new threat. Draxor roared, a sound that seemed to shake the stars themselves, and then dove toward the nearest ship. Plasma bolts fired wildly, but the dragon moved with astonishing agility, weaving through the barrage. With a powerful swipe of its claws, Draxor tore through the first ship's hull. The vessel exploded in a fiery bloom, its debris scattering into the void. The remaining two hunters adjusted their formation, firing in unison, but Draxor twisted in midair, its wings carrying it above the blasts. The dragon unleashed a torrent of fire, its flames engulfing the second ship. The vessel spiraled out of control, its engines failing before it detonated. The final hunter hesitated, its pilot clearly reconsidering their mission. Draxor roared again, its fiery breath grazing the ship's shields. The pilot turned tail and fled, disappearing into hyperspace. Back on the Resolute, Jamie and Mara watched from the cockpit as Draxor circled the ship, its dark form illuminated by the faint glow of a distant star. Jamie pressed his hand against the viewport, a wide grin spreading across his face. "He did it," he whispered. "He saved us." Mara shook her head in disbelief. That dragon is something else." As Draxor returned to the cargo bay, Jamie rushed to meet him. The dragon crouched low, its molten eyes fixed on the boy. Jamie placed a hand on its snout, his voice filled with gratitude. "You're amazing, big guy." Draxor rumbled softly, lowering its head until it rested against Jamie's chest. Mara joined them, her expression still wary but softer than before. "I guess you were right," she admitted. "He's not a monster." Jamie smiled, his hand never leaving Draxor's warm scales. "No, he's a hero." The Resolute resumed its course, the danger behind them, for now. Jamie sat beside Draxor, the dragon's massive body curled protectively around him. As the stars stretched endlessly before them, Jamie couldn't help but feel a new sense of purpose. The galaxy was vast, full of challenges and unknowns. But with Draxor by his side, Jamie knew they could face anything. Together, they had forged a bond stronger than fear, a connection that would reshape the stars themselves.